thank Taskeen for agreeing to give a talk, and I'm very interested in the topic. But I'll hand over to Zushini to introduce Taskeen, and then we'll have about, I think it's about half an hour or so for the talk, thereabouts, and then the rest of the time for questions.
Great, thank you so much.
Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you everyone in the call for being here. So my name is Zushini. I'm a current student of Digital and Social Change Pathway and a co-organizer for the seminar series. Before we start, I just want to remind everyone to turn off your microphone during the presentation. Like Niall said, there will also be a 30-minute Q&A after Dr. Adam's presentation. And before handing it to Dr. Adam, I will first do a brief introduction of her work, as well as the focus of the session. And so Dr. Taskeen Adam has taken on many hats, both in and outside of academia. She's an associate manager with Open Development and Education, a senior research lead at EdTech Hub, and a research associate at the University of Johannesburg. Dr. Adam is passionate about addressing injustices in open and online education in low and middle income countries. She completed her PhD on addressing injustices through MOOCs, a study among peri-urban marginalized South African youth at the University of Cambridge. Her research highlights that historical injustices, cultural imposition, and economic dependence continue to play a pivotal role in education. Dr. Adam has over 10 years of experience in education and EdTech in LMICs, including conceptualizing, developing, piloting, leading, researching, and managing various EdTech projects. So the title of this series, this session is Tackling Coloniality in EdTech, Addressing Digital Neocolonialism in MOOCs, in which we talk about how dominant MOOCs platforms created by Western universities tend to embed Western-centric epistemologies and propagate this without questioning their global resonance. Consequently, such MOOCs can be detrimental when educating diverse and complex participants as they erode local and indigenous knowledge systems. This talk draws out parallels between colonial education, specifically across Sub-Saharan Africa, and digital neocolonialism through Western MOOC platforms. And I'm also going to start recording, so, oh, okay, recording already started, but if anyone has any issue with that, please say that in the chat. And it's all to you, Dr. Adam.
Thank you so much. Can you see my screen fine? Great. I was just telling everyone before the masses joined, but it's really an honor to speak to all of you today, because if I could go back in time, I would have loved to do this. In fact, I think I would still love to join your cohort and do this course again. It's really such a great concept. So in today's presentation, I'm going to focus on the topic, but I also thought that as a bunch of students interested in this topic, I'll share a bit of my personal journey as a PhD student, and also how I have 2 foots in academia, but also in actual like practitioner implementation support, technical assistance, policy development. I kind of have different, as Shinji mentioned, like different hats on at different points. So happy to also talk about that in the Q&A session. So just to give you a quick overview of the presentation, I'll start off just telling you a bit about the background of my research, and I'll actually spend a lot of time sharing my different conceptual frameworks and theorizing with you, as I feel like that's actually the meat of what I've developed. I'll then talk about the outputs of my research, which was basically these approaches to designing justice-orientated MOOCs, and then give you some key takeaways from that. So just to kick off. So my research, and me as well, I'm from South Africa, and my research is focused within the South African MOOC space. And South Africa has a high level of inequality, and this stems from colonialism to apartheid to just like the injustices that are embedded into the current everyday system. So South Africa is one of the most unequal countries in the world, and so it's actually a good micro perspective of the entire globe as it stands, because we know how much inequality is represented, not just between countries but within countries as well. And just to give you a snapshot, within COVID, these inequalities just exacerbated between schools that had access and schools that didn't, and how the different approaches had to be to respond to the sort of shift to EdTech or to teaching and learning online. And from my experience within the different groups that I worked with, I felt like there were two sort of bubbles growing within this like COVID response and how EdTech can support this. And so on the one hand, on the left side, is sort of those who had some level of access to technology and privilege. The type of conversations we were talking about was like, how, when should we teach synchronously or asynchronously? How do we do online assessments and proctoring? What is the best LMS? Which video conferencing platform should we choose? And then on the other hand, in some of the schools that had, like in some of the schools and teachers and learners that did not have access to devices or internet, the challenges were completely different. One of the things that people often overlooked was like the lack of access to school feeding programs in schools, for example. If many students would go to school and that's where they would get their daily nutrition, but when schools were closed, how were they going to access that? And so the impacts were almost like beyond just what teaching and learning holds. It was bigger systemic issues within the education system. And so that dichotomy kind of gives a nice background to the inequalities that I want to talk about today. So within my research, I've looked at the open educational movement, OEM and OER, open educational resources and MOOCs, and looked at the inequalities that are that can stem from this. So, for example, some of the research in the past, and the stats would have changed by now. It's many years since I've re-looked at this, but just looking at English OER is only 1% of it comes from Africa. And Niall, you were just saying this before the course, like, where do resources, theory come from? And here we see only 1% of OER comes from Africa. When we look at MOOCs, only 1.7% and 1.1% of MOOC producers on Coursera and FutureLearn are Black, or and in my particular research, I looked at Coursera, and that was in 2017, and 7.3% of courses, only 7.3% of courses were from the Global South. So that kind of brings me to what my research topic was. And what I did was I looked at two different groups, MOOC designers and potential MOOC participants. Potential MOOC participants were those who were not in any formal education. And those were ideally what MOOCs say that their target group would be. So, people who don't have access to university education, but would, on the periphery and would like to receive these sorts of courses. So I looked at these potential MOOC participants as well as the MOOC designers, and first tried to understand who are they, so what are their needs, their preferences, their aspirations, and what are their views on justice with respect to education. So what do they view a just education being? How would they want their education to be ideally? Then at the same time, I looked at MOOC designers and tried to understand what impacts MOOC designers in terms of their embodied, distributed, and situated cognition. So understanding how who they are impacts what they do and how they create and teach. And this goes beyond just a MOOC, but it is emphasized in a MOOC because in a MOOC, you are teaching a global audience. So it's not just you sitting in South Africa teaching your South African students. You have a much more diverse pool of students that you need to reach to. And then I also looked at how these South African MOOC designers adapted their courses to, especially in the wake of things like Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall, where topics of justice and decolonization were rife in universities, how these designers, these lecturers decided to adapt their courses to include these sentiments within it. So that's sort of the background of my research, and the culmination of all those different things was to look at the approaches to sort of take all of that information and design the approaches to designing justice-orientated MOOCs, which is what I'll present to you today. And within that approaches, I look at bringing together those needs, preferences, and aspirations of students and match them with the approaches that MOOC designers were taking, the best practices or the effective practices to bring that together. Okay, so yeah, just to give you a background, there are about 250 participants in the research as potential MOOC participants, and then about 27 interviews in South Africa, and I also interviewed people based in the US, MOOC designers based in the US. So just to give you a quick overview about MOOCs themselves, I think most of you would know what MOOCs are, but here I just want to talk about how MOOCs have actually evolved and are not strictly what people often refer to MOOCs now as just like any massive online course. And the historical differences between them as connectivist MOOCs or traditional MOOCs has actually gotten quite fuzzy because at least in the most effective practices these days, many people have incorporated both aspects. So you have the social learning elements of them and also the more traditional pre-recorded video perspectives. Just looking at openness, MOOCs have always been, well, at least there's also always been criticism of MOOCs in terms of their openness, because their content has not always been openly licensed. It's not always been easy to download and reuse content. So that has always been a question mark on that O. And just talking about the online aspect, since the beginning of MOOCs, lots of hybrid versions of it have appeared, such as wrapped MOOCs, where it's almost like a flipped classroom model for MOOCs, where you actually have a specific cohort you want to reach to, and they might have a balance of having the content online, but then doing it sort of working through and talking through it with a cohort that is physical with them. And the last thing is that MOOCs originally were just a course online that didn't have any accreditation, but the biggest demand in MOOCs has been for some sort of accreditation. And so many MOOCs have developed this diploma or degree track, which has then meant that many people have now put fees or cost engaged with doing MOOCs. And so that again taints the openness of them. So now I want to just go through some of the different conceptual frameworks that I developed within my research. So the first one was actually, before I started anything, was I looked at the open education movement, and through the literature you could see that three different so all of these are critical perspectives, but there were three different levels of critical perspectives about open education. And the first one was the neoliberal critique, which I've kind of touched on already, especially within the MOOC space, where it problematizes open washing, where the word open is used when the tenets of open aren't actually embedded in it. It's more used for branding or marketing or freemium models and things that are not strictly in line with what the legal definitions of open could be. The next was the social injustice critique, and this problematized the idea of openness as good in and of itself. And here the idea was that open does not equal equity, right? So you still, if you really want something to be equitable and just, you need to do something more than just make your course open. And that was the sort of the social injustice critique. And then the neo-colonial critique built even upon that to emphasize that within this movement, there's also geopolitical imbalances and cultural epistemic imbalances between the global north and the south, and the creators and the consumers of this content in topics like language, politics, and various other aspects. So that's kind of what shapes my work. And now within my research, I use a sort of grounded theory approach. So I kind of dotted. There's a lot of concepts on the screen right now, and I kind of these all emerged from what participants mentioned, or it kind of snowballed into me unraveling what are all the different concepts that I needed to build my conceptual framework in my research. So all of this culminated in forming something called the dimensions of human injustice, which I'll emphasize on a bit more. So kind of looking at the decolonizing aspect, this is something that I research, especially in the background of, for example, Roads Must Fall movements, or Why is My Curriculum White? This was, in the midst of my PhD. So understanding what decolonizing meant was really important to me. And if we look at the spheres, one aspect was to talk about decolonizing the curriculum, but this actually then looked at the university, looked at the broader education system in general, from pre-primary to primary education, to looking at decolonizing at a bigger space. And the point here is that you can't really just talk about decolonizing the curriculum without looking at how it fits into everything else in society, how interconnected all of these aspects are. For example, talking about education without looking at healthcare or land inequalities, where some students have to travel hours to get to university and others don't. All of these play an aspect in looking at decolonization. Now, decoloniality by definition involves dismantling of relations of power and conceptions of knowledge. I'm just reading off the screen here, that foment the reproduction of racial, gender, geopolitical hierarchies that come into being. However, as powerful as that sounds, practically it's really difficult, right? And so in South Africa, different versions of understandings of decoloniality have emerged, and you can apply this to different contexts in different parts of the world. So the first one is Africanization, where there has also been a strong movement for a replacement of European knowledges with African knowledges or South African knowledges. And the stance here allows for marginalized knowledges to be reclaimed, but it can also run the risk of nativism or co-option by political agendas and national agendas to achieve something. Then you have Afrocentrism, which is about decentering. So it's not so much as like eradicating European knowledges, but it's about recentering them. So it's about the positionality of how you look at these things and putting to center what is most applicable in, for example, the Africans' daily lives. Here, there's still this critique of the risk of romanticizing things that are just because they're local and indigenous means that they are infallible, which we know is not true. Every knowledge group has room to reflect and integrate and improve. And just because something is local and indigenous doesn't necessarily mean that it is infallible. So the last one is knowledge as entanglement. And this stance argues that knowledge is actually really inseparable and entangled over history, over time, over place. And it's really not useful to say, this is African and this is Islamic and this is, different Greek or something, because really over time, knowledge has traversed the world and improved upon each other's through, discourse and debate. So with this stance, the critique is that if you take the stance, normally knowledge is, you always say history is written by the victors. These stances will be sort of prioritized and other knowledges will be marginalized. So you often have to flip between these different approaches to see what's most appropriate. So when we come to decolonizing education, what do we actually mean? It could be reclaiming different identities, languages, and cultures. It really means going beyond the concepts of diversity to look at true transformation and dismantling power and privilege. And it kind of problematizes the idea of looking at the world through Eurocentric prisms. And really just jumping to the last point is about looking at it in terms of promoting a critical consciousness and reflexivity. So when we're looking at digital neo-colonialism, we really, and this is defined as the use of information technology and the internet by hegemonic powers as a means of indirect control or influence over a marginalized group or country. And here it shifts from colonialism, which was more of the understanding of a group of countries influencing others. With digital neocolonialism, it could be a nation, a corporate, an NGO, international NGO that has this sort of soft power that tries to influence another space. And it could be economic, social, or cultural. And it could also promote this idea of calculative thinking, so that's like, a rational perspective is the only way to think about the world. And in literature, this has been called different things. It could be cyber colonialism, data colonialism, techno-capitalism. This concept has been emerged in in different schools of thought. So when we look at colonial elements in EdTech, the first one, especially with mass platforms like MOOCs, is this idea of globalizing education, where a platform might be regionally based in the global north, and states that it is global and universal, but it actually mainly centers white or Western-centric knowledges, values, norms, beliefs, systems of thinking, and this can be detrimental to the marginal, the non-dominant knowledge groups. It can tend to promote, looking at the second one, like sort of a Western epistemological framework, which can be more rational, secular, universal, objectivist, modernist, and neglect to look at things like from a spiritual or ancestral or embodied or communitarian sort of ways. Language is one of the most mainstream critiques, which is that looking, that content may be in the dominant languages like English or Chinese, even Spanish, but not look at other mass languages like Hausa or Hindi that could be a language that can reach masses, but often doesn't. Then we have this core to periphery model where there's one-way transmission of the knowledge is developed in a certain place and it's distributed to a diverse group of global participants. And then when we look at the technology, there's also bias or colonial logic within these, depending on the data sets that these platforms are trained in, specifically in personalized learning or even MOOCs that may use these algorithms. And here trying to understand who are the designers that develop these algorithms versus who are the users within that. The last one, adverse incorporation, looks at EdTech a bit more generally. And it looks at how, as we move to EdTech, young learners are being co-opted into this way of learning where their data is monitored and tracked, but they don't actually understand what that means and how that could impact them in the future. Also, looking at this from a geopolitical perspective, when these EdTech opportunities are given to marginalized learners, there's often no real opportunity to opt out. So you either use this personalized learning platform or you don't have any education. So there's no real choice in opting out. And so this kind of brings me to this dimensions of human injustice framework that I developed, drawing on all these different concepts. So the one school of thought came from social justice frameworks, which were actually rooted in more European or Euro-American understandings of justice, but have kind of evolved over time to include more recognitive elements of justice, and then decolonial frameworks. And the three frames that I look at is material injustices, cultural epistemic injustices, and political and geopolitical injustices. And this is how I analyzed the MOOCs that I was looking at in my research. And from here, I developed 4 different categories. And when I say MOOCs, you can just look at online courses in general. The first would be MOOCs that actually perpetuate injustices. And I don't think anyone's ever going to brand their MOOC as that, but what it could be is just inadvertently giving a specific historical narrative that excludes other certain histories and viewpoints. And again, it's not wrong. In fact, everybody will always highlight a specific narrative, but the subtlety in the difference is stating that this is a perspective versus this is the pure truth and there's no negotiation about it. So things that don't acknowledge their positionality in their frame. The next one is MOOCs that embrace open philosophies but don't really get to the point of addressing injustices. And this can be courses that are about in the tech IT space, for example, that might want to use open source programming and things like that, but they don't really get to the equity level of things. The third one is MOOCs that do strive for justice, but their target group isn't the most marginalized learners or participants. So it could be a MOOC that's designed for an engineer or for a journalist or an activist who will then go to a community and support, or whatever they learn will impact the community that they're trying to reach. Whereas the fourth one is MOOCs that try to actually include those marginalized groups in the teaching and learning that they're promoting. So it could be, for example, an inclusive education course that's designed to work in lower resource areas. Now, within my research, I have three key arguments. The first one is that there's no one-size-fits-all framework to addressing injustices in your online teaching and learning. You need to use different approaches and at different times based on who the target group is. And the three approaches that I highlight are justice as content, justice as pedagogy, and justice as process, which I'll unpack in a bit. And then looking at the second point is looking at course designers. And for me, this is critical for them to examine their subjectivities and how these shape the framing of the MOOC from its conceptualization. So really looking at the people at the table here. And the third one is emphasizing factors that go outside the curriculum. So when people look at making their course inclusive, they often look at, for example, universal design for learning, right? Which still focuses on what goes in the course. But I'm sort of saying step out and look at the conditions of your participants and the learners and how that affects them to understand how you can then improve the actual course. So looking at the surrounding factors. And so from all of this, I designed these 4 decision-making spheres. So different places that you can intervene to ensure that a justice-orientated approach is taken. So the first one looks at MOOC production, and this is at the senior level of MOOCs, where we look at institutional rationales for MOOCs and those higher level decisions. Conceptualizing the MOOC is then when you decide what is the topic, what is the purpose, who is the target audience, and then situating the MOOC is what I mentioned, is looking at factors surrounding it, right? Technological accessibility, language accessibility, what support do learners need? Are you actually advertising and reaching those who really can benefit from the course the most? And then the fourth innermost element is where we normally focus on, which is the constructing and implementing the MOOC, looking at different pedagogical factors, power structures within this. I know we're at time, but could I ask for 5 more minutes just to take you through some guiding principles that I wanted to do? I'll just shoot them pretty quickly. Cool. So the first, I just want to take you through 4 principles because I don't have time to go through that whole framework, but I'll share all the resources afterwards. So the first one, which I've mentioned before, is looking at including epistemically diverse stakeholders at the decision-making table. So here, from my research, what emerged was that MOOC designers' identities were crucial. Who they are, what they value, how they understand the world was really important in shaping a MOOC. But a MOOC designer can't be everything. Nobody can be everything. And so the idea here is to bring different partners, collaborators, experts, practitioners, teaching assistants who have different perspectives on the world to ensure that you have diverse views in the creation of the MOOC. The second one is to use different justice-orientated techniques to address different injustices in the learning environment. So here I mentioned them. Justice as content is looking at bringing different sources into your work, but this might work when you're working, for example, a specific subset of groups of students in South Africa. But once you go global, you can't expect the content to be relevant to, those students in Latin America, or India, or, different participant groups. So that's when justice as pedagogy comes in, where you want to involve a critical thinking and co-creation between course mates to address that element. And the last one is justice as process, where you make sure that you include a diversity of stakeholders. The third point is to ensure that the MOOC purposes align with the target participants' need. And I'll just quickly show you, there's different purposes of MOOCs, from teaching showcase to gateway MOOCs that help students transition between different phases, and then things like a research showcase, where you might have a specific MOOC designer that's a specialist in a certain field and wants to showcase it. But then on the flip side, you have different types of students, right? From students with marginalized backgrounds to prospective grad or undergrad students, to professionals, to work seekers. Everyone has a different intention for coming to a course. So making sure that you connect those two. And then looking at the different personal factors that impact your learners in their surroundings. So it's about the situating the MOOC. So, are they a family? How much flexibility do they need? Looking at what their daily lives might be to make sure the course matches with that. And the last one is looking at different pedagogies to achieve different learning objectives. And this, I think you can go through in your own time, but there's a variety of different ways in which you can interact digitally that can really create critical thinking and problem-based or scenario-based learning, but you have to practically design that into the course. So yeah, kind of just looking at various content types, and different ways of assessing or not assessing learners. So I will wrap up there. Thank you so much. Sorry for going a bit over time.
No, thank you so much, Dr. Adam. That was so amazing. Both in such a short period of time, walking us through both the philosophical underpinnings and also with very specific examples. Now we're opening up to the audience, so please raise your hand, and Teams is very helpful in putting them in order, and I'll just partially instrumentalize myself and call on everyone individually. Sagarika?
Thank you so much, Dr. Adam. That was packed course in itself. So I know it was quite nice to go through all of it in one go. So I think my question is with regards to MOOCs being massive and also reaching out to such a huge target audience. So one would be, do you think the scale of MOOCs would have to be brought down in order to reach specific target groups and make sure that we fulfilling their pedagogical and content based needs? And two is, do you think then this would result in a shift in MOOCs towards more STEM based learning, which is already there, and away from social sciences, which is generally local and more specific?
Yeah, these are great questions, and I think they deal with the fundamental limitations of MOOCs. So you have MOOCs and ROOCs, which are regional online courses, and SPOCs, and there's a whole variety of these silly acronyms in my perspective that are just variations of online learning. But I think what's interesting to look at is the India case, which you might know of, Swayam. And they managed to adapt things. I'm not even sure if it's the best way, but what they did do is acknowledge the need for accreditation, which then made MOOCs more mainstream rather than just supplementary knowledge-seeking course. It made it something that was instrumental to teaching and learning within the country. And so they have accreditation centers where you can actually sit and do an exam after a MOOC, after you've taken a MOOC. But the limitations there is that it's still that very instructional. You watched a video, now you go and write a test. So it's really sticking back to that behaviorist model of teaching and learning and not really incorporating the critical elements. But that's an example of how massiveness has then joined to practical. But those types of concepts, exactly as you've said, are more in line with STEM-based things where here's a set of things you need to learn, and then we can evaluate it. And it neglects other aspects. But you do have those connectivist MOOCs, which are more about social learning, and Future Learn is a platform that promotes that. But it's much more harder to assess and accredit, especially assessing it in a justice-orientated way.
Victoria?
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. That is so fun, and I really like your conceptualization. I was trying to write them down and screenshot, but I guess I'll ask for them.
I'll share the slides with you, by the way. So yeah.
I wanted to ask, I thought particularly your principles around the guidelines around how to develop MOOCs better or make MOOCs work for more people. As an academic, how do you make those guidelines reach people who can then act on them?
Reach the people who can act on them?
Yeah, so you've developed these guidelines, what are mechanisms for you to sort of disseminate those guidelines? Yeah,
so that's a good question. So I'm not sure how it works in Oxford, but most universities have this, they call it different names, but it's like a center for teaching and learning. And that's sort of the hub in the university that used to design LMSs and whether you use Moodle or Sakai or whatever platform the university uses, or in a school, and then that department runs the MOOCs, the development of MOOCs, right? So they will have so basically, to cut a long story short, it's through that department that you go through. So I've done this presentation where I actually go through, for you guys, I just highlighted 4 guiding principles, but there's actually many in that whole, that 4-tier approach. And so you kind of present this to them, and they can incorporate that. Also, just to note that my research stemmed from these departments. So when I researched MOOCs, I went to these departments and saw what were the most effective practices. So it's almost like learning from them and bringing that back to them.
Jamal?
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I also have to go through and delete a bunch of screenshots now that I know you're sharing the slides.
I should have said that in the beginning. I actually wrote it down.
But I had a kind of question around the idea of going beyond diversity and inclusion rhetoric, but also kind of the note of reconceptualizing the dominant languages. So I'm wondering if in specific spaces like India, for example, that is highly linguistically diverse and within itself has kind of internal battles between different languages like Hindi and Tamil, how do you kind of look at the sort of how would you suggest or have you kind of come across those moments where a language might be aggregately conceived as non-dominant or present in MOOCs like Hindi, but maybe regionally dominant, and how do you kind of coalesce that history?
Yeah, this is so spot on with one of the findings in my research, which was within South Africa, a lot of the MOOC designers would make Africa courses, which were great at sharing African knowledges with the world. But then in order to share it with the world, they would use more global languages. And so they were addressing the need of, cultural epistemic injustices by sharing African knowledges with the world. But that same course was not applicable to the local groups. There was no Zulu, there's no Xhosa in those. So how do you balance addressing, supporting your own local group versus sharing your knowledge globally? And I think the middle ground to that is where technology can support and where openness can support, which is, can you translate? Can you transcribe? Can you make a voiceover? Because the same course could then be translated to different languages. And that's how you make the same content accessible. In some examples, a MOOC design, a certain university would have created a MOOC, and another group somewhere else, because the content was open, they could translate it and help their local group access that same content. So that's where technology can really help to share knowledge in different languages.
Niall?
Thanks. I hope I'm not jumping ahead here. I saw a few hands up there earlier, but I think they've been taken down, so I hope it's okay. Taskeen, really interesting talk. Thank you very much. There's sort of one question I was thinking about in relation to do you know good exemplars or examples of any MOOCs that have followed your approach, just as this process, for example? And the second part of that question is related to things that look like MOOCs but may not be MOOCs. So I'm thinking about mobile access, perhaps people using WhatsApp groups and things like this to have a sort of a MOOC type approach, but usually are working with more marginalized communities. I know there's a couple of projects within EdTech Hub who are doing that type of work in during COVID, for example, to reach out of school children, particularly in rural communities. So just wondering if you could speak a little bit more to those 2 points. It's really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. So the first one was like, MOOCs that did use this concept. Some of them I mentioned here in the examples list on this, and I'll share that with you. So my research really stems from the South African use case, because that's there were actually not that many MOOCs. I could actually look at all of them within the South African space. At that time, there were no more than 40, right? And a lot of them did incorporate these principles. So I really drew on them. Some that I can mention specifically was the Education for All MOOC from UCT. There was an entrepreneurs one as well from UCT that worked with local entrepreneurs to develop their skills. I think it was social innovation. I'm not sure if it's listed. So the last one, Teaching for Change. No, wait, I can tell, yeah, there's quite a good few ones. Looking at these topics, you can look at them. And they all didn't do the 3 approaches, process, content. They all chose different elements, but depending on who their course was, that approach was the most applicable. The second one, the second question you had was about different variations. So today I just presented about MOOCs because that was the topic, but there's a large variety of ways. Let me just see if I have the slide here in terms of technology, different ways that you can adapt for different technological needs. Offline, looking at offline, some of the stuff we're looking at in EdTech Hub is, for example, chatbots using WhatsApp, using shared device principles. So there really are very low cost ways of getting technology out, and that's what we're investigating. For example, would a 1 tablet per school model work? And do you really need to reach the learners, or can you, as long as the technology can empower the teachers, is that really what's needed? Do we really need to get a device into every learner's hand, or is the most effective way to improve learning outcomes supporting the teacher themselves? We're also looking at the 1 billion personalized learning model in Malawi. And I've also been involved with looking at personalized learning in low and middle income countries, where we reviewed 40 different products. So a lot going on. I don't think I can answer that question fully right now.
Hannah?
Hi, thanks. I was wondering if you've had any feedback from students who've taken classes that are either completely adopting your approach or somewhat adopting it.
Yeah, so I have not designed a MOOC myself to be able to answer that, but the people I interviewed did. And for example, there was one sort of anecdotal story in the MOOC that I was telling Niall about, the one about Education for All from UCT, where it was done in a way that someone could do it from their mobile phone. And so local groups of teachers in like rural and remote areas were able to access this course. And they actually have some good videos like of them sharing like how much just accessing this course, you know, partially offline from their mobile phone actually impacted teaching practices in that area. So there are some really good anecdotal stories when you adapt it. The other story was the translation movement that I told you about, that they really liked the course, and so they translated it to make it more useful to others.
Great. So we still have 10 minutes. We still have time for a couple more questions, but I'm just gonna shoot a question myself, and then if anyone raises their hand, I'll call them. Thank you so much for this amazing talk, Taskeen. I have a question about, so some of us are thinking about transitioning to kind of become practitioners in the spirit of EdTech, and I'm just wondering, do you have any kind of expert tips about, like you mentioned, these systems are so complex, and sometimes you have to be very contextualized and be at times pragmatic about the considerations and what are the main things that you're trying to influence and push under a tight timeline. Yeah, I'm just wondering, do you have any kind of suggestions and helpful tips as someone who's has such expertise in the field for us?
Yeah, I mean, I can also just take a step back and say, like, particularly after doing a PhD, there's always this pressure to become an academic, right? Or to carry on with the sort of academic track. And I think it was COVID that helped me to spin out of that mindset and realize that, okay, I can actually still go back into practitioner work and government support and be able to be, in my opinion now, like more useful to the world rather than just like writing papers and things like that. So not to diss academics, but I felt like, you know, I can actually take what I learned and impact, you know, support that growth. I think the point that you mentioned about being pragmatic and practical is unfortunately just so important, because you're working within these unjust systems, right? And the main thing that I'm working with is the international development aid game, right? Where a lot of the funding comes from the big organizations, whether it's like FCDO, World Bank, which, you know, they do have good intentions, but it's just built into their model that the way things work are very colonial. So one thing could be looking at how evidence gaps are determined, right? So they might look at research and say, okay, this is an evidence gap, but these are also shaped from the political agendas of global North institutions. So you have to balance that and understand, okay, well, this is what donors want you to research, and this is what the country is actually saying they need support in, and trying to look at balancing those two. There's also, I would say, a colonized mindset in various countries that will almost like, what is the word, when you kind of align to the donor needs. So you'll see the needs arising are exactly what the donor is asking, because that's where the funding comes from. So a whole bunch of projects on girls' education now, because the donor released funds for girls' education. So everybody's focusing on that. Not necessarily because, I'm not saying it's not a need, but it's aligned to where the funds are. So a lot of things happen. Another example is the focus on messaging. So that was identified as a high potential evidence gap. And so you see a lot of projects and initiatives aligning to investigate the use of messaging. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Rebecca?
Right, that was a cop-out. I didn't really answer your question. I was just like, it's difficult.
It's such a complex wordy, gave some really practical suggestions.
Thank you so much. It's been so interesting, the whole talk. There's so many things to think about. But one thing I wondered, it'd be really interesting to get a bit more of your participants' perspectives, if this came out a lot, is that you mentioned the challenges of data and obviously data being quite extractive, and, you know, the kind of problems of the knowledge that it kind of prioritizes and produces. And I just wondered, in your empirical phase of your work, did that come out much from the students or from the designers? And whether that kind of follows through into some of your recommendations under those big four that you've already talked about.
Yeah, can I honestly say that students don't mention this because they don't realize the impact of it, and so that's someone like that sort of finding would be coming from me as an outsider who then realizes that, like, well, especially with marginalized groups, they will agree, and this has happened, for example, Facebook Free Basics or other platforms that, if you don't have access to any education or any good quality education, and here's a platform that says just sign up, and you don't even realize when you're signing up which third parties are going to have access to your data, because that's always hidden in the hidden. No student's really going to go and read through all of this to see where their data is going. So they often don't know, firstly, and then they often don't have it. Even if they did know, they don't really have a choice, because if you want to learn from this platform, you're going to sign up. Like, especially with MOOCs, like, if here's a great course, I want to learn about, big data, you're going to sign up for that course and do it irrespective of that. So the choice element is not there. The third aspect, you didn't ask this, but I think it's worth sharing as well, is that a lot of things can't be taught in a virtual space, and by shifting everything online, we often lose certain elements. I think you would say, like, hidden or implicit elements within the teaching and learning space. And so some of the stuff that I draw in other presentations is, like, for example, looking at Islamic epistemologies in teaching and learning, where shadowing the teacher and looking at who the teacher is, they are the source of that, like their mannerisms, their kindness, their respect is so important as part of the teaching and learning process. And you can't really replicate that in, like, an online course, right? Because it's about shadowing in a perspective. So a lot is also lost.
No.
Just a quick second question, if I may. There's two parts to it. I think, just to follow up on quick point on Rebecca's point around data, and even look at what Teams is doing. I don't know what it's recording of this, for example. Conversation. I think we touched on that in class as well, about the terms of use for tools like that. So just to echo that point, Taskeen, you were making. But my question related back to, I think I've stolen actually one of Sangharika's questions from one of the classes, which was around the relationship between the decolonization agenda potentially, or the prospect of it being sort of hijacked in a sort of a nativist way, going back, and then this nice idea you had around knowledge as entanglement, I guess on the other side of the spectrum. So could you maybe just from your own perspective speak to sort of that kind of tension, or that kind of how you see the decolonization approach being played out in different sort of contexts?
Yeah, sure. And I'm just resharing that slide again. I think it's really tricky because my perspective is that you need to use different approaches at different times. So it's not like the entanglement one is, the entanglement one sounds nice for us, like, as maybe as researchers in very global institutes like, Cambridge and Oxford, you have so many people in your class from different countries, right? So that almost makes sense that that's the most logical one to go to. But then if you go to a local university where you need to address local issues, the other options might be more relevant. So I think it really is about looking at what's the best case for different scenarios. And that's where also the content as process versus, justice as content versus justice as pedagogy comes in. Because if you had to go, and it depends, again, what do we talk, if the topic is climate change in South Africa, right, then obviously that content is going to be focused on there. But if you're trying to look at different aspects, you'll focus it at different. So another cop-out answer is just like, you have to adapt to ensure that you can engage with critical thinking and develop your ideas. But we also have to acknowledge that these local knowledge groups have not had the chance to develop and solidify and determine what their thinking is until we can have many PhDs written in local languages And to be honest, that's kind of a colonial statement in itself, to think that a PhD is, you know, a definition of knowledge being, you know, reaching maturity. But you get what I'm saying? Like, we need that knowledge to grow, in a sense, before you can engage with other knowledge groups on equal playing fields. Yeah.
Great, thank you everyone for your questions. We are almost at time, so if Lau or Rebecca have any concluding notes.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me okay? I took ages for my mic to unmute there. So hopefully you still hear me okay. No, just to say thanks again for a really great talk. And I was just going to ask, maybe for others, not that the PhD is the font of all knowledge, as you were saying, but it'd be nice. Is your PhD available to be shared?
Yeah. Of course, it's open access.
I think for people to read it.
Yeah. I'll share a bunch of resources after this, as well as the slide deck, and then you can circulate that around.
Super. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Adam, for giving us this amazing talk. So our next talk is this Thursday from noon to 1 p.m. Dr. Bernie Hogan will present the use of personal network approaches in teaching, discussing pitfalls and potential. So hopefully we'll see you then. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Adam.
Thanks, everyone.
It's a
Thanks
pleasure.
again. Bye-bye.
Bye.